And we are live. For those of you that are joining on LinkedIn, please pop me a comment and let me know because last time the LinkedIn stream was a little choppy. I already got a comment. I'd like to see that. Uh, just keep in mind, I am streaming on YouTube as well as an alternate stream, so I can pop that link to you if you're having trouble on LinkedIn. But hopefully, LinkedIn is smooth this time. I got Tim Crawford, and this is really a delight for me because I've been wanting to get you in the hot seat for so long. So, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. It's always great to engage with you when we see each other kind of on the road. And so, I've been kind of one of those longtime listener, first time caller, first time
Oh, man.
participating, right? Because I'm kind of off in the shadows, sometimes commenting myself on
Indeed.
LinkedIn.
So I don't do like formal intros. You guys know that. Hey, Thomas, great to see you. I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about this. I don't normally do formal intros, but I want to tell you a little bit about what you have in store for you today. We're going to do a whole CIO in the pressure cooker, about 40 minutes of discussion on that. That's going to be super interesting because that's right in Tim's domain. And then we're going to push into a discussion on next gen analyst relations. And Tim, I got a cool thing for you about Josh. Josh actually changed his plans today, his travel commute plans, in order to be here for this discussion.
Dude,
So, yep.
that's so
So,
cool.
yeah,
Thanks, Josh.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
And
you're awesome. Even before you change your plans, you're awesome. So glad you could
and
join us.
Jason, hey, nice to see you. And Jason, I'm going to be pinging you on our conversation we've had in the back channel, just FYI. But bear with me, I got some travel coming. So I don't usually do big bios, but I do want to do real quick on like how do you get on my show, right? And why is Tim here? So Tim is what you might call one of my favorite pesky questions specialists. So what started to happen is I would go to these analyst events and I'd be like, who's this guy asking this question that really cuts through the noise and consistently. And then I started getting to the point where, Tim, pretty much every time you had your hand up, I'd be like, okay, this is going to get interesting. And generally speaking, what you do at these events is you ask questions that I find cut to the chase in terms of what customers care about, because a lot of times that sounds really simple, like why would we be talking about other things besides what customers care about? But as we know, including my 4,000 word piece on AI agent hype that I just published, like there's a lot of hype out there and a lot of misdirection. And you have this way of just bringing things back. So we're going to get into like how you think about the market. But that's what I've noticed about you is you want to always bring this back to what this means for customers.
Yeah. And I think, part of that, John, not getting into my bio, I mean, I'm pretty public online in terms of who I am and what I've done and what I stand for. But the thing is, I'm not a career analyst. And so I've been a customer of most of these enterprise hardware, software services companies at some point in my career. I mean, I've led IT organizations and have served as a CIO in the past. So I come from that customer standpoint. When we're sitting with an SAP, for example, guess what? I've been an SAP customer twice over, right? There aren't a lot of analysts that have gone down that path and have that experience. And so not to pick on the analyst necessarily, but my point is that's how I'm wired. And so when I'm coming into these conversations, I'm coming into it as if I were a customer. And that's
Right.
the lens I'm looking through first and foremost. And then, of course, thinking about the other pieces around partners and vendors and the rest.
And one of your core areas, of course, is their domain of the CIO and how that is under disruption and changing. And there you also bring hands-on experience. So that's an important point I wanted to mention to our listeners. You're not just assessing this from an analyst viewpoint. You have been in that seat. You have faced those pressures. I'm sure you have had some really fun security discussions, for example, with colleagues, and you've experienced all that firsthand. So,
Yeah. You want to see the scars or we're not going there? I
yeah,
mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've had CISOs and built security organizations over the course of my career. So yeah, I've been there. I've done that. I've walked a mile in those shoes. And I think that's it's kind of a unique perspective to bring into these conversations, which then makes it an incredibly rich conversation, especially when you're talking about vendors that don't necessarily have that firsthand domain experience.
Yeah, and Thomas agrees. As an analyst, one also needs to work with the buyer side. It helps
Yep.
tremendously. Um,
And
we were,
John, I was just sorry to interrupt. I was
yeah,
just going
sure.
to say, the other piece to set the context for this conversation is a full 50% of the work I do is still advisory and engagement with other CIOs. So this is another unique attribute of the work I do versus others is a full 50% is with other customers. And then the other 50% is working with the vendors. And so that brings a lot of iterative domain experience, ongoing domain experience into the fold and into the conversation. So,
Nice. So we
yeah.
should have a low amount of BS in this conversation. I probably won't have to press the bullshit button today. So that's cool. And we will be getting back to this analyst piece, but just so y'all know that I really want to hone in on some CIO issues. And for those of you who have watched my show for a while, this is going to be a bit of an old school countdown structure where we get into some of the misconceptions about CIOs and then some stuff around where to go from here and with the CIO role. But before we do that, Tim, I want to ask you a question, which is a little bit of a loaded question. But when I think about CIOs, I think I have in my mind sort of a definition of a modern CIO that I juxtapose pretty dramatically with what you might consider a classic inward facing, keeping the lights on type of approach to the CIO role. But do you accept that framework? Modern is obviously kind of a cheesy ass word. There's other ways of describing it, but do you accept the framework that the CIOs, in order to be business relevant and current to our concerns now, need to go through some type of change? Do you accept that, or how do you look at it?
Totally. And the way I look at this, and I've talked about this for some time. I even wrote about it several years ago, talking about the persona of the CIO. First and foremost, a CIO is not a CIO is not a CIO. So let's just get that straight. I class them into two categories. And of course, nobody fits into a box. So it's really just a gradient of gray. But at one end of the spectrum is the traditional CIO. Tends to work under more of a command and control mentality and culture, is looking at applications versus infrastructure. And then you have the transformational CIO at the other end of the spectrum. And they might be somewhere in the spectrum. They might have components of one and components of another. But the point is that the transformational CIO is a business leader first who happens to have responsibility for technology. And it's important to understand that because you have to look at the persona of the CIO. You have to look at how they lead their organization, not run, how they lead their organization. And then you also have to think about how the rest of the company looks at the IT organization, right? So there are multiple components that come into play, but you're absolutely spot on right. There is a difference between CIOs that lean more traditional versus transformational. And I will say, in my past, I was a traditional IT leader. I mean, that's where I grew up. In the 90s, that's where I grew up. Right? That was the way IT operated. Today, you have to be a transformational leader to succeed. And a lot of those traditional ones, and I mentioned this recently at a CIO summit a few weeks ago amongst a group of 50 CIOs. And I said, look, many of you in this room will not succeed. Mm-hmm. You'll perish. And it was kind of a dramatic statement to make, especially considering the audience. But there's some truth in that too, is that some will have a hard time making that transition. Some will be just fine to make the transition, but your point is still spot on.
Okay. It looks like there might be some LinkedIn slow streaming again. I'm going to paste in the YouTube link just so y'all have it if you're struggling a little bit on LinkedIn. Sorry about that. I think LinkedIn has got some issues they need to work through on that of late, because I was at a LinkedIn program for video practitioners and they had problems with their stream during that too, which was kind of embarrassing, by the way. So yeah, what's interesting, Tim, about that is I think one of the tough things for CIOs is that while that I'm totally with you on that transformational role aspect, there are some components of that traditional role that you can't escape from either, right? So it's a little bit thankless because we're asking CIOs to change, but at the same time, if you get caught in a cybersecurity thing that you should have been prepared for because you didn't like patch, whatever system or whatever was on your watch. Well, you screwed up and you're going to face the heat. So like the traditional stuff doesn't really go away either. It's like you got to have all that sorted and then the new stuff, right?
Of course. I mean, from an operations standpoint, you still have to have that underfoot. That doesn't go away. That never goes away, right? But it becomes more table stakes. It is not the front and center of this is what we do. This is
Right.
part of you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you get dressed, you work. I was going to say you go into the office. We'll probably be getting back to that again. But my point is, there are certain things that you must do as a CIO. And operationally, you got to keep the trains running on time. Bottom line. If you can't do that, I guarantee you will not be able to be invited and participate in those strategic conversations, those transformational conversations. So I do think that this is part of that transformation of the persona that needs to take place is how do I start to not just myself as a CIO, but my organization, how do I get them oriented such that they are making sure that the trains are running on time? Because that doesn't go away. That doesn't automatically just disappear. And now I just get to do all the rainbows and roses. That isn't how it works. More
Right.
gets added to the plate. Stuff doesn't come off the plate. And so that's part of that kind of psychological shift that needs to happen in terms of the persona. But yeah, you've got to keep the trains running on time. Bottom line.
By the way, Thomas, a couple things. First, I do have an applause meter as well, in case you're wondering. I have been known to use it if someone's really knocks me over with something. And Thomas,
You
if
can put that one away.
Thomas, yeah, you seem to be doing okay over on LinkedIn at the moment. So if you can keep me posted, Thomas, on how that's going. And also, you have a question for Tim. How far are CIOs wanted to be business leaders by the line of business heads?
So it's a great question, Thomas, and great to see you on the chat. Hopefully we'll cross paths again soon. I guess the thing I would say is that, again, this goes back to the individual CIO. Do they want to be this transformational person? And then does their leader, like if they report to the CEO or if they report to the CFO, does that other person view the CIO's role as strategic? And then you have the broader, kind of to your question, you have the broader context of, does the rest of the company, does the line of business leader look to the CIO as a true partner in conversations around technology? So if I'm the CMO and I'm looking to address some specific business functions or outcomes that are part of the leadership team's objectives, am I inviting the CIO to the conversation and say, okay, I want you to take part in this marketing conversation, or the COO talking about some of the supply chain pieces? How do I start to get to a point where I change the perception? And this starts with the CIO. It doesn't start with the line of business. It starts with the CIO. But how do I start to change the minds of those other LOB leaders so that they look at me, if I'm the CIO, they look at me as, you know what? I'm a strategic business partner for you. I'm not just a technology leader. And when you start to do that, that's when the magic really starts to happen. But there are a number of steps to be able to get there. We're not there generally yet.
Yeah, I think we'll get back to those steps a little bit. Ashish has a question that kind of builds on this. The whole discussion about CAIO, AI focus pivot for CIO, is making the rounds, and it reminds Ashish of the chief data officer and chief digital officer 7-8 years back, and he's checking your views that will this be a transitionary stage or here to stay?
Yeah, great question. I wrote about the CDO when it started to come up, and I stand by it still. And frankly, it's starting to play out. And quite frankly, the CAIO is going to follow in the same steps, which is, if you're hiring a CDO, you probably don't have the right CIO. That was the bottom line of my post. If you're hiring a CDO, you probably don't have the right CIO. Because that's really what the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, should be doing. I mean, technology is going to come and go, just like AI. we're already in the last 12 months, there's been a marked decline in the number of conversations and the intensity and frothiness of the conversations around AI amongst CIOs. Why is that? Well, it's because it's not about the technology. It's about what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish from a business standpoint. So that's one particular piece, is that I think the CAIO will follow much more quickly than the CDO in that same pathway. But then the second piece to this, and this is where I get a little testy with it, with CDO, CAIO.
Right, here we go.
Is
war on monikers. I love it. Okay.
Well, the same thing, John, is come up around, should we change the title of the CIO? Hogwash. Like, let's just make the CIO do what the CIO should be doing and call it a day. And the other piece to this, and this is where I get a little testy, is we keep wanting to throw these chief officer, right? The C and the O. We want to keep throwing these chief officer titles around. But the reality is, these are not chief officer titles. These are not at the same level as a CEO, CFO, CMO, COO. They are absolutely not CHRO. They are absolutely not. There are probably 5 chief officer titles.
But Tim, they look so good on business cards. They're so sexy and cool.
But this is the
impress your friends.
Fine. So this is one of the problems that we have with CIOs today. There are a number of CIOs that are out there today that have the title because they were an IT director and they got a promotion. But they didn't necessarily they didn't elevate themselves, or were elevated by their leadership team to expect a different outcome. They're still doing IT director work or VP of IT work, but they have that CIO title. Yet, here's the test. They're not seen as part of the executive leadership team. They're not at the same table as the CEO, CFO, CMO, COO.
That's a tough test, but I think a fair one. Marine says, amen on the hogwash points. And by the way, Marine, great to see you, and thanks for staying up late. Glad to have you in the chat as always. And Josh is saying about not just the Department of No, but I think where Josh is going there, in my view, that's kind of interesting, is around not so much no, but that one of the problems with the CIO historically was being too much of a bottleneck for business requirements and stuff like that. And in my mind, that's one of the things the CIOs really have to step back, and it's like, their criteria should be, if I equip the business to build applications quickly that are compliant, secure, I've done my job, and I can step out of the way and not be controlling everything. So maybe that's a little bit of a compromise between what Josh is saying and your view. I don't know.
What Josh is highlighting, quite frankly, is IT, not the CIO specifically, but the IT organization has been known as the Department of No. And having done a number of assessments since I have left my last IT leadership role, I will tell you that there are kind of 2 buckets that kind of contribute to that. You have one that's for good reasons and one that's for bad reasons. And the bad reasons is you've got organizations out there that they just make it really hard to work with them. And so, of course, nobody wants to work with IT because inevitably it's too hard. There's too much friction. And so this is where you start to get shadow IT in some cases, right? Is that I'm just not working with IT. They always say no to my request. And frankly, sometimes it's because they're not really good communicators as to why. And sometimes they're just not understanding what the problem is and how this ties to some business outcome. That's the bad side. The good side is when there's complexity in IT. Now, you can agree or disagree till the cows come home as to whether there should or shouldn't be complexity in technology. The reality is it's there. So until you accept that, until you respect that, you're going to have a really hard time. And so one of the challenges is it puts a higher onus on the IT organization to effectively communicate why that complexity exists. So it could be for regulatory or compliance reasons. It could be because we've been running 30-year-old architecture, and guess what? We just don't have the funding to be able to do it because we've been having to spend our resources on getting you the next best thing. But you have to effectively communicate that. And this is, technical debt starts to eke its way into this as well. But it's important to understand those dynamics. And that, frankly, gives you a better appreciation. But let's be honest, a lot of IT organizations struggle to communicate and effectively market themselves internally. And that contributes to that problem.
Josh is proposing chief hogwash debunker. I'm not sure that's going to catch on, Josh, but I like the spirit of it. I want to hit on a few comments.
Yeah.
And then we'll see where we go from there. So, hey, Sam, sorry LinkedIn's eating your comments, but yeah, hallucinations, I suppose, are in play. Keep trying, folks, and I did paste in the YouTube link as well. And then Maureen says that no one wants to work with IT as a mirror for what's going on with ops teams. Interesting parallels there, which I find in general, this sort of fight of admin versus strategic is kind of everywhere and just has a different kind of flavor to it. And Thomas is talking about complexity. In his experience, IT complexity goes up the more IT reduces complexity for a line of businesses. That's an interesting concept. Instead of getting rid of complexity entirely, can you hide it from the user? In some ways, that can be pretty effective too.
My belief, Thomas, is that's a dangerous strategy, because what happens is you start to pile complexity on top of complexity. I talked a little bit about this in my CIO playbook for 2024, which you can find on my website, avoa.com. Talked a little bit about this, and simplicity is one of the key pieces because our world is getting more complicated, not simpler. And so any opportunities you have to simplify your architecture, simplify the number of vendors you're working with, simplify how your organization works, your decision-making capability, all of those things and many more things, you have to work toward it. If you don't, you're just kicking the can down the road, and you run the risk of having it come up at a very inopportune time down the road, and you don't want that.
Thomas agrees on dangerous. He's just making an observation about that. Just as a quick framing, I want to spend about the next 10 minutes or so hammering away at sort of misconceptions and problems and obstacles. Then I want to spend a bit of time kind of going forward on what you think the most effective CIOs are doing to combat some of that, so we can have some takeaways here. Sam says Department of No is a great phrasing, but I've also seen Department of Everything Yes, which could be equally worse. And this gets to a point that's on my mind right now, which is AI, because I think there's a misconception amongst some that the job of the CIO is to enthusiastically embrace AI on behalf of the organization. I'm calling bullshit on that. What I think the CIO does, and you can tell me if you agree, I think a good CIO will have a narrative for how AI can effectively be adopted by the organization, what the obstacles are, what the pros and cons are, what the technical limitations are, what the vendor hyperbole is, which is actually what's possible on your project and in your business plan. I'm looking for the CIO to offer a reality check, not just the Department of Yes, as we alluded to in the chat there.
Yeah, I mean, Sam's absolutely right. The Department of Yes is probably worse than the Department of No, because now you are accepting pretty much anything that comes your way. But kind of to your point, John, I actually have a little bit of a different view on that, which is
excellent.
I don't think that governance bodies like your board should be dictating technology. We saw how this kind of played out with regards to cloud. It was bad, right? Where you had governance bodies that were saying, hey, we need to be cloud first. What did that get us? That plus the marketing, which brilliant marketing, cloud is cheaper. Cloud's just someone else's data center. It's easy to use. You just lift and shift. I mean, we've all seen these ramifications that come from this, right? Unfortunately, you see the same thing. And I just tweeted about this. So there's a gentleman at Amazon who does enterprise strategy. And so his name is Tom Godden. And he was talking about this very issue, which is, you get the CEO that comes and says, "Hey, what's our AI strategy?" And his point, he was very apropos, very apropos. Now, mind you, Tom's a former CIO too, which is great. So one of the things that Tom said is when the CEO comes to you and says, "Hey, what's our AI strategy?" What you should be saying is, "What's our business strategy informed by AI?" And the point of that is really kind of to my earlier point of a governance body or a leader like the CEO should not be dictating technology, but rather we should be orienting and focused around the business objectives, the business outcomes. And then the CIO and the IT organization should determine what's the right technology to bring to bear here. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's Gen AI, maybe.
Right.
Maybe it has nothing to do with it. We just need a relational database.
Agreed, 100%. I just think that AI's, in my opinion, we may have a disagreement here, which is interesting, but in my opinion, like AI is a little bit different because there is a pressure to have an organizational response coming from the board and coming from the use of shadow tools and stuff like that. And I don't think you can simply just be supporting strategic business objectives. Just an example, like I wrote this AI agents piece today, and one of the things that's underlying that is my notion that a lot of folks that are pimping the heck out of AI agents don't understand that the underlying generative technology. Now, not all AI agents rely on generative LLMs and stuff like that, but the ones that do are relying on a flawed technology that is not magically fixed through RAG. I'm sorry, it's just not. And if you really study the AI experts who are trying to solve these problems, they're poignantly aware of this. And someone in the organization has to understand the technology, Tim. And I'm pointing the finger at the CIO for that. They're the ones that have to be able to say, no, you can't use AI agents to resolve major disputes with your top clients and automate that. You can't use it to make buying decisions and purchasing decisions beyond a certain threshold because it's not going to get it right every time. You have to at least have humans supervising this. And if the CIO can't explain the technology, then who can? So that would be my stance on that.
So, John, I don't disagree with any of that.
Okay.
But the piece that I disagree with is when you have a governance body like the board or a senior leader like the CEO dictating technology out of context. And so this is where
right. Inserting technology into a business conversation prematurely. That's what
right.
you're objecting to.
That's exactly right.
Yep,
so business first,
I'm good with that.
Technology follows, right?
Right.
And so
the only reason I brought that up is I think sometimes business executives are bringing up the technology before the business case as well. So that's my problem with AI, whereas in the past, you didn't see that as much, right? You didn't see that with like metaverse or whatever.
Of course, but we're in a different era where now we have the consumerization of AI, and so everybody gets to see how this kind of plays out. That this is the first time that we've really kind of seen this. We started to see it at the end of the cloud piece, but we're really seeing it with AI. But there's another piece here. Go back to what I was saying about the role of the CIO, and a CIO is not a CIO is not a CIO. If you have a transformational CIO, and I know a number of them, it's not the majority, but I know a number of them, and I will tell you, those folks are not dictated to in terms of which technology to use. They're ahead of it, and they're having the conversation with the CEO, and they are actively engaged with the board and the technology committee and talking about what their strategy is. So instead of the governance body or the CEO or another line of business leader coming to them and saying, "Hey, I need this AI agent," the CEO's already, or the CIO's already engaged with them and driving that conversation. That's the transformational CIO. And the reason why that's happening is because they're already ahead thinking about the business, the whole business and where it's going. And also they have the relationships with each of those different organizations and line of business leaders to be able to get ahead of it and anticipate what's going to be needed to be discussed. That's very different than a traditional CIO.
Yeah, indeed. Ashish brought up some interesting things around cobots and humans and robots and collaboration. I don't want to go too far into that today because I want to stay focused on the CIO in this conversation, but I think if you read my agents piece, you'll find a lot of action there. And y'all are having fun with my metaverse comment. It was just it was just an example. The fact that we aren't donning crazy headsets for this conversation is a disappointment to some venture capitalists, but sorry, that's just not how the world turns.
Put your aluminum hat on. Here we go.
Hey, by the way, Thomas, if you're still in the audience, I think I might have decisively finally be declared victor of that Web 3.0 debate that we had.
He's there.
I think I won that. Can you give me some kind of prize belt? Anyhow, so Tim, I want to spend a couple more minutes on misconceptions, because I asked you to kind of prepare for us for this conversation, some misconceptions people might have about that role. I'm guessing we probably hit on a couple of them. Are there any that we missed that you really want to hit on?
Let me just kind of run. I've got probably 4 or 5 here that I prepped. So let me just kind of run through them real quick. And
great.
we could double click on any of them that the audience wants to look at or you're interested in.
Okay, so folks, these are Tim's top CIO misconceptions as we perceive the role. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, mistakes and opportunities. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. This is top of mind, kind of the common things that keep coming up. Number one is best practices and old playbooks. This worked. CIOs that are thinking, hey, this worked for me 5 or 10 years ago. I'm going to take that playbook and I'm going to play it again. That doesn't work. The world's changed. In fact, if you really wanted to get testy about it, the playbook and the way you ran an IT organization or led an IT organization 5 or 10 years ago need not apply. Like, really, technology organizations have evolved that dramatically in such a short period of time. Number 2 is don't ignore your technology debt. Understand your tech debt. It's not sexy. Let's be honest. It's not sexy. It's not fun to talk about. It's hard to talk about, but you cannot ignore it. And that is not to say, and don't read into the pundits that say that all tech debt is bad. That's crap. Some tech debt is strategic and it makes a lot of sense to keep going with. So make sure that you know what your tech debt is, what you're keeping and what you're not, and what the plan is.
I could think of some airlines that would agree with you, Tim, on that, by the way.
Well, okay, so I've worked with major airlines, so I have a little bit of inside baseball here. But one area there, we're not going to talk about it today, but one area there is mainframes. There is a place for mainframes. So talking about the demise of mainframes is a little premature. That's not to say it's not a blanket statement with any of these, right? So the third item is align your tech strategy and organization with the company objectives. I think this is one thing that often gets missed, is that CIOs and IT organizations don't really understand, like, what is the company doing? Like, how does the company make money? How does the company spend money? They don't get into that level of depth of more than, like a clothing retailer. I sell shirts and pants and people come into stores. You need to understand like dynamics around distribution and manufacturing and timelines and costs and all of that. And who are the players that are involved in it? Number 4 is focus on what matters most to the company. What matters most to the company today, and most of the conversations that are having at a board level and in an executive leadership team, ELT level, are around customer engagement, supply chain. So there's an efficiency conversation, there's a growth conversation, and then opportunity and risk. So where are the opportunities? Where are the risks, right? And then you could talk about cyber, but cyber is just one component of risk. So keep that in mind. And I don't mean just cyber and ransomware and that you're done with risk. Right. Like, there's so much more. Right. Number 5 in this is, as I started to highlight, is understand your business intimately all the way through the organization. So the most junior person on the team that's developing code for your company internally, do they know where that code fits in and how that impacts your company? They should. And some of the best IT leaders, they have had their whole organization where they know exactly the value that they are bringing to the company. It's impressive. So that's my top kind of 5 of mistakes and opportunities. Some of those, if we were in a group of CIOs today, an audience of CIOs, they might be scratching their heads going, oh crap, what do I get some work to do.
You sparked some really good conversations with that. I think there was definitely that we could probably spend a lot of time on tech debt. We could probably do a whole show on that, in fact, and maybe we should consider doing that at some point. But just quickly, Josh really would love to hear examples of strategic.
So I'll give you a couple. Yeah, I'll give you a couple quick examples, Josh. And I think we've even talked about this maybe a little bit. I mentioned mainframe, but quite honestly, it's not about just products. It could be older products. So software services, hardware. I've walked into data centers where they've had literally compact tower systems strapped on a shelf in the data center. How many years has a compact tower system like been out of circulation running Windows 2000? So you have these kinds of tech debt pieces, but it also applies to architecture. So think of all the architectures that were built 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even, and they're still being proliferated today, right? Your EAs or your enterprise architects are still using that kind of fundamental piece. That's a problem. Not all tech debt is old, by the way. Tech debt could have been put in yesterday,
Right.
but it's an old way of using it. And then the last is just around process, right? And you're using old processes that need to evolve, but you do it because of this complexity that we talked about. It's not as easy to just say, hey, I can twist this. Guess what? You twist that. It's a ball of yarn. IT is a ball of yarn. You twist this here and it has ramifications through the rest of the organization. It's really complicated.
Maureen, I'm sorry Gwen Stefani isn't here to sing this. I'm just a girl who needs data. I'm sure she could do it justice. Standing in front of, let's face it, a bunch of guys hoping they'd realize our data categories were invented 25 years ago. They're hard-coded in for an era long past. So she's echoing your old playbooks theme.
Well,
strongly there.
She's talking to something, and I just had a conversation a couple months ago with a group of CIOs around data warehouses. And one of them was actually putting in a new data warehouse. And one of the problems is the more structured you get, the more capabilities you have in one direction. But the problem is the more inflexible it is in a different direction. And as we know, even today, with the dynamics of where data is coming from and the velocity and whatnot, and the types of data, it's not as easy anymore to build up a data warehouse that's going to stand the test of time. In fact, most of them that they do stand up, guess what? Day one is great. Day two, they're talking about re-architecting it.
Maureen wants a transcript about those old structures. Maureen, no problem. Ping me. I don't publish transcripts, but I send them to individuals. So if you want one, let me know. And Greg, finally, glad you got the link. Sorry that wasn't coming through. I guess Frank Scavo's lurking somewhere in the chat. Frank, would love to see your comment if someone can surface it. Frank is formally retired, but blogging up a storm on his Substack. I highly recommend you track Frank's career reflections because they are really interesting. And then Jason says, you've got the CIO no strain business relationships, cloud innovation, and a new era of execs who know enough to propose dangerous solutions on OpEx budgets. In today's world, who owns and is authorized to make changes to enterprise architecture? Wow, Jason, that's a nice can of worms. Thanks.
It's a great question. It's an absolutely great question, and that's part of why the dynamics for IT leadership have got to change, right? You've got to have the right relationships in place, which then gives you a lot of overhead to be able to do things that you otherwise would never be able to do. And you kind of get away from these folks proposing these kind of crazy situations in scenarios and technologies because they're exposed to it, right? They're exposed to more technology today than folks outside of IT, and the everyday layperson is exposed to more technology today than they ever have. And so they can come to you with suggestions and ideas, which can be dangerous. And so if you have the right relationships in place, if you're already getting ahead of where the business is going, those actually become an add-on rather than a sideshow. And that's the piece that kind of comes into your mental model and strategy as a CIO, a transformational CIO, as you kind of work forward.
So I'm with you on that. And I think there's certain kinds of transformational CIOs that just get it. And I wrote about one recently in the context of how they handle this cybersecurity incident and how they're pursuing a real-time framework for their business. That's in my recent articles. And you can tell, Tim, when you're talking to that type of engaged transformational CIO, there's just something, they kind of ooze a certain kind of relevance or something that I really like. But I also kind of think about those that kind of want to make that transition, but maybe it's tougher sledding for them, or maybe they have more organizational resistance. And obviously, in some cases, all you can do is leave and find a more supportive and aggressive organization or whatever you want to call it. But do you have conversations like that around like how how do I kind of move ahead like in that like demystifying the steps, because I think sometimes it's like, oh, these transformational people, but how do you get to that point? How do you evolve into that?
Yeah, so you're talking about two different dynamics. So one is a vendor and how do they identify those types of personas, those CIOs? Because I said a
Right.
CIO is not a CIO is not a
Yeah,
CIO.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something that I've been coaching vendors on, right? Is what are some of the dynamics? What are some of the factors that you look for? If you're a seller, if you're doing marketing, like what are some of the signals that you're looking for to identify, kind of who this person is and where they sit in that spectrum? And for me, it's kind of natural, but for someone that doesn't work with literally dozens of CIOs every single week, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding what those signals are is important. The other piece is understanding, what you need to do if you're a CIO today and you aspire to transform to that transformational CIO. What are some of the things you do? And I have kind of a quick list that we had talked about,
Yeah, let's
that I
run
kind of
through
developed.
this.
All right, so another lightning round. Buckle in. Here we go.
Yeah, here we go.
So number one is stronger C-suite relationships, including audit and legal. So one of the first and second relationships that I would always make is with my head of legal or head of audit and my head of finance, because I know over time I'm going to have to regularly engage with these folks. And so I would much prefer to understand who they are, what makes them tick, what they're focused on. So when issues come up, like let's say I have a security breach, one of the more dynamic examples, but not the more common one. But when situations like that come up, guess what? I know exactly what my audit team is going to ask me about. And we have a relationship. And so guess what? I can go to them, like John, I'll use you as the example. I can go to you, John, and say, John, guess what? We had a breach. I know you're looking for X, Y, and Z. Here's what we're doing to work on that. I'll keep you apprised. Let me know if there's anything else you need. And you're going to go, holy crap, this person actually, thought about what's important to
Mm-hmm.
me, makes my life a lot easier, right? And we have a pre-existing relationship. So the relationship is not based off of that breach, but it's based off of putting in the work ahead of time. So stronger C-suite relationships. I also say that one of the strongest C-suite relationships that has got to exist in today's era is between the CEO and the CIO. Technology plays such a dramatic and important role to every single business, regardless of industry. And yet that relationship is one of the weakest across organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, sustainability. This is not a big topic today. Guess what? It's coming back in vogue. So get ready. There's new legislation that's going to hit January 1st, 2025, that's going to put this on everyone's radar. Guess what? Nobody's prepared for it. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's thinking about it. And to be fair, it's really complicated what you have to do to go through it. This is not an IT problem, but IT is a big contributor to what needs to be reported as part of your financial reporting. So we're gonna be talking about this in the coming year. People are gonna have to pay fines until they can kind of ramp up. So I fully expect to see that come back. Number three, and we just saw this just recently with California State Bill 1047, AI legislation. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reported that there's something over 400 pieces of state legislation just in the US alone. I was at the Wall Street Journal's CIO Summit in New York this week, and one of the comments was that there's actually over 800 pieces of legislation that are at different stages through the state legislatures. This is not federal, states. California has over 30. So as a CIO, as an organization, forget about the CIO, as an organization, they've got to start getting their heads around this. And it's going to be really complicated and really hard to follow, but you don't have a choice. You gotta strap in. You gotta strap in. And that's just state. That's not counting anything federal. That's not even counting global. So global, you get even, I mean, the complexity starts to grow because then you start to get into sovereignty rules and the rest. And then you have industry as well. And then the last
Tim,
is
just one sec. Brian, on the video, it seems like some people are having luck watching on YouTube and commenting on LinkedIn. So have someone post a YouTube link for you. Sorry that the stream's getting hung up. Glad to see you here. Oh my God, the collective brain wattage in this chat is through the roof right now. Thanks for being here, folks, and fighting through some of the technical things.
yeah,
Go on, Tim. Sorry.
Yeah, no, the comments are just fabulous. I love it. I love the engagement. We need to have more of this, quite honestly.
Yep.
So the last thing that I was just going to say, and it kind of puts a cap on what I've been talking about to this point, is the role of the CIO. We need to have a more candid, open conversation about what the role of the chief information officer is and does, so that role really does get to that transformational level and is seen as a peer amongst the ELT, no different than the CFO, CEO, CMO, COO, CHRO, those key chief officer roles. And then making sure you have the right CIO that is capable of operating at that role. They might not have the right tone and cadence. And this is one of the reasons why you don't always see CIOs in the boardroom, because quite frankly, some of them that I've met, you don't want them in the boardroom. And when we get into CISOs, it's even worse. So that's a whole another issue. But those are some of the key things that we have to be looking at, and as an IT leader, you absolutely have to be thinking about today.
Great stuff, Tim. We're going to wrap the CIO conversation in just a couple minutes to shift over. But Brian wants to say plus 100 on the ESG point you're making. Brian has written a really good guidebook on ESG I recommend to readers. But one of the things that I think is really important that I like about your work, Tim, is that I think sometimes we fall too much into the vendor narrative, which is so much about AI, but in the customer community, there's other stories emerging, and it's our job to call attention to them. And ESG is one of those stories where it can ebb and flow a little bit, but then you're going to get smacked by a whole new wave of requirements. And where were the people in the customer's ears saying, get ready for this? There needs to be people like that. And so that's part of the goal of these sessions, is to surface that. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I think, John, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in our next part of the next segment in the conversation, but I think many folks have kind of over-rotated to focus on the vendor.
Yep.
And kind of lost touch with what the customer needs to do, or how the customer is coming at this. And I think that provides a bit of a skewed perspective. And so what I'm trying to do is, if you will, bring a little bleach to the gene pool and say, okay, can we get real on this?
Yep. So save the rest of that. And then Brian says, I'll bet one of your items will be the need for the CIO to be cosmopolitan, aware of one's environment, and connected to more people than just their staff and a handful of strategic vendor relationships. I think that ties in pretty closely to your points.
Absolutely. CIOs, and I was actually just talking about this week in New York, and I've talked about this before, is that, CIOs have been a pretty insular group. In some ways, unfortunately, it's been an old boys club, but that is changing slowly. And so, yes, they have to build relationships outside of the CIO kind of conclave, if you will. There are some that are starting to do that. They need to get exposed to CEO conversations. They need to get exposed to other personas. And that is starting to happen. And the transformational CIOs, they seek that out. The traditional ones don't even know where to start.
Okay, one more. Ashish just wants real quick tips on scaling AI adoption beyond the initial disconnected POCs. I will also add, Ashish, that a lot of POCs for AI don't work very well because it's hard to simulate the impact on live data. So it's a really troubling area in terms of that type of adoption you're describing. Tim, any quick comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just take it a layer above that and say that I think a lot of the POCs start with a false premise of what they're really trying to prove out. And so that once they try and prove it out, they realize there's no, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? It's not worth pursuing. There's no, the value isn't there, but they're not tying it to a business outcome, which is meaningful.
And Thomas Weeman says, work with actual business use cases to deliver value. That's never out of fashion, I would say. And the IT jokes, there is a little bit of an irony that we're talking so much about IT today, and I'm actually having IT problems, which is unfortunate, but there you go. Anyway, Tracy, it's great to see you in the chat after a while, so happy to have you back. And KPIs that measure success, and that's a whole nother conversation. So now we actually are going to switch gears to a different topic, and I don't usually do that, but I'm going to switch. I'm going to take a really short pause here. And I am back with Tim Crawford once again. And guess what, folks? We're shifting in a different direction. We're going to actually talk about next-gen analyst relations for a few minutes. And some of you in the chat are going to be like, well, that's not as relevant to me. But in fact, what we're really talking about here is how to have more open conversations across the so-called ecosystems or communities or whatever you want to call them that are more beneficial to everyone doing a better job and delivering better projects. That's how I see it. And I do think that analysts can play an important role in that. And I've had an evolution across Diginomica where more and more in the last number of 6-7 years been more formalizing the analyst thing and going to a ton of analyst events. And so I come at it from a different direction, and I always kind of end up meeting other outliers and independent voices, a number of really great ones in this chat today, by the way. And that's kind of how Tim and I met. But I wrote a piece a while back on next-gen analyst relations and what would it look like. And the piece was kind of a combination of a number of factors. I kind of have a 12-point framework that Tim has promised me someday he will riff on formally in a blog, which would be awesome. But in the meantime, I think the piece kind of struck a chord because you were planning a very similar type of post, I think, in some ways. And perhaps what you and I have in common in all of that are a couple things. I mean, I think one core thing about my post was that we seem to lose track of the fact that aren't we really trying to serve the customer? And if we're really trying to serve the customer, then doesn't that change a whole lot in terms of what analyst relations should even look like? So that was one of my points. And the next point was just things around how the speed of today's business environment doesn't lend itself well to a lot of the practices of old, which have to do with, I release this quadrant or this trapezoid once a year, and then, we meet once a year and we have a day-long thing or whatever, and it's like, come on, man. I mean, things are moving fast right now, and I need like a continued dialogue to help me do my job better. And so those were, I think if I had to pick from the 12, those were a couple of my key points. But I wanted to really open the floor to you in terms of not just my piece, of course, but just in general, because you've had an interesting experience as well coming into this so-called analyst role and analyst events from a different perspective. And what has that been like for you, and kind of what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks for everyone that is participating in the discussion. I think we need to have more of this, right? So just to set the stage so everyone understands, I'm a former CIO coming into analyst relations. And so what that means is I'm not a career analyst. I don't know how the traditional analyst model worked. I do have some inklings of it now, but I'm not going to say I'm an expert in that. But to your point about customer centricity and customer focused, I come from that customer focus when I'm coming into these analyst summits and discussions with vendors. And I got to say, most of the conversations, it's very vendor centric and it's very industry centric, meaning how do I compare against my competition? But what's lost in that conversation is not just the perception of what they think the customer is doing, but the actual domain experience. And this is one of the items that's kind of in my list, and I've got a few that I'll highlight. But many analysts don't necessarily have domain experience in the areas that they're covering. So that's one piece that I find is a disconnect. But we have to understand analyst relations and industry analysts are another channel for a vendor to influence customers, to communicate with customers. Just like you've got partners, you've got sales organizations, you've got analyst relations. And so I think this is one piece. And Thomas, to your point about being external mouthpieces, I want to talk about that. So hold that thought for just a quick second. So I think this domain experience piece is something we have to get back to. The other piece is we've spent a lot of time focusing on specific verticals, right? You've got analysts that I focus on this particular technology, but customers aren't looking for this particular technology anymore. They're looking more horizontal. Whether they say it or not, they are. They're looking for something, but they're looking for the adjacencies that go with it, or they're looking for the platform. So take a big product like an SAP, right? They might be looking for one particular product, maybe a couple, but at the end of the day, they're going to try and look at the other pieces too. And so how do you start to bring that together? And I think this vertical versus horizontal approach is something else that has to change. The other thing I was, kind of to Thomas's point about being external mouthpieces, there's a conflation that's coming back or coming into the mix, which is the difference between analysts and influencers. And so I think the question should be, what are you first and foremost? Are you an analyst that has domain experience and therefore could have influence over customers? Or are you an influencer that can influence customers? And so it's important to understand those dynamics because those are not the same. Those are absolutely not the same.
This is an interesting comment by Jason. John, perhaps analysts need to be more closely aligned with customers and user groups of the vendor partner solutions. And Jason, I would agree with that. And one thing I will tell you is that you can't force analysts to adopt the kinds of mindsets that Tim and I are talking about today. And unfortunately, my experience has been that a lot of them want to stay in whatever their lane is. I'm actually really shocked sometimes with some of my analyst colleagues that don't even want to make it out on the show floor and talk to customers informally because they just want to file whatever information they need on product updates and roadmaps and move on. But I will tell you that I've gotten frustrated with vendors on this point because I've written a lot of articles around this topic. And one of the things I keep pushing vendors on is, why aren't you much more creative in terms of these kinds of interactions? So, for example, a lot of vendors have VIP customer events that are also aligned with these conferences, and like mix these groups up. Like they have things to say to each other. They enjoy talking to each other. Like, why don't we make more of these connections? And so there's just a real difference in philosophy sometimes. But I will tell you that I seek out user groups and seek out customer interactions. And I'm sure, Tim, you do. And you also have that in your client work as well. But if I didn't have that, I don't feel I could do my job credibly. But not everyone agrees with that.
No, I'll double down on it. Absolutely. And this is the reason why 50% of the work I do is with customers. 50% is working with customers, predominantly the CIO. That's because having been a former CIO, having worked with those folks, I'm also a member of the Wall Street Journal CIO Network and a number of other CIO roundtables around the country. I will tell you that is an incredibly deep and rich source of information around the CIO. Now, there are some other dynamics, so don't like put on your Christmas list or holiday list that you want to get invited to those, because unless you've been a CIO, it's hard to get into those. But your point is still accurate, which is, how do I start to get more engaged with customers? And you should actually be pressing vendors at these events to set up those one-on-ones with customers. Right. Hear it firsthand from them. I'll give you a good example. There was a customer, I'm going to leave the vendor out of the mix. There was a customer that went on the main stage. This is a major customer. Every single person listening to this has heard of this company. Every single one, I guarantee you. Even my mother knows this company. So the customer gets up on stage and says, "We are all in with this vendor." Great. That's good. I meet with them one-on-one afterwards, and I'm having a conversation. And what it came down to, and I was pressing on that, like, what does that really mean, all in? Like, does that mean like the product that you're producing to your customers? Does it mean your internal IT? Like, help me unpack that a bit. And what it came down to was the actual technology that they're using to monitor their products and services that customers engage with them on, that is all in with that particular vendor. They had no plans whatsoever to move any of their IT systems to that vendor. To me, that's not all in, right? Now, that's not to say that it's that it's bad in terms of the strategy of that customer,
Right.
but it's important to understand the dynamics and the reasons why. And the why is incredibly powerful, but most people don't double click to figure that out.
We got some really important comments in the chat I want to take a few minutes on. Josh says, hey, Josh, thanks for putting off your trip. Hopefully you can leave soon. I continually remind AR folks who are too focused on their message that my job is to make their customer successful, not the vendor. Hopefully we have the same goals in mind, but not always, unfortunately. And Josh, I want to hit on this a little bit further because I think one of the areas there that's really key is that customer success is a long game, not a short game.
Yes.
And so one thing that vendors really struggle with sometimes in these gatherings is acknowledging weak points and saying, you know what, you're right. You've pointed an area where we are weak. Let's benchmark this and note this. And next year we're going to give you a progress report and show you what we've done better. And a lot of times at these gatherings, some of the most important things happen when folks like yourself, Tim, or Brian Summer did this at an event I was at recently, pulled someone aside and alerted them to a big issue that some customers were having around, in this case, something around cloud provisioning. I don't want to get too specific, but the point being, some of that success talk actually comes with a hard edge. Yep. Because it's about taking a tougher snapshot. So I wanted to call that out because it's not as simple all the time as just oh, we're going to be successful. Let's have a success conversation. Sometimes it's actually a hard conversation because you need to shore up a weakness in how you're delivering and fulfilling for customers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And let me give you two very quick examples. Number one, I had a CIO that approached me that wanted to, again, I'm going to leave the vendor out of the mix. Because it's frankly not important. It's the gist that's important. CIO reaches out to me. We're interested in this vendor's next gen product, but I kind of want to understand what's the maintenance involved with doing that? What am I going to experience? Can I connect with another CIO to have that conversation? I run it through the channels with the vendor. So reach out to the AR team. They run it through the channels. They're like, okay, we got to get sales involved. Totally get it. Totally understand that, right? But they wanted the CIO to fill out basically a prospectus of tell us the size of your company, what's the market potential, what's the TAM of it, all of this other crap before they would even make the introduction. And of course, I told the executive, I know the CIO, they're going to just blow up and basically go tell you to pound sand, which is exactly what he did. And what I did then is I said, I went back to the vendor, and again, this is a household name, went back to the vendor and I said, you know what? Screw you. You screwed this up. And I made the introduction directly between that CIO and a CIO that I knew was a customer of that vendor that could answer those questions. And they recognized that they had screwed up. And this was kind of their process run amok. So that's one example. Second example is a CIO that came to me, relatively new customer of this vendor. Again, household name vendor, relatively new. They were the darling, part of a specific program they have for onboarding new customers into their product, really complicated product. And as soon as they signed the contract, they felt like, okay, it was crickets. Nobody's calling us back. Now we're starting to deploy this one major module, and we're not getting the time and attention that we need, and nobody's kind of engaging. And now we have to engage a GSI to rewrite an application because we're getting pressured in terms of our internal business processes. We're gonna screw our business and our revenue if we don't go in a different direction quickly. And I'm like, hold that thought. I made a phone call to the executive that it was in charge of that division of the product. Within 24 hours, they were on the horn with that CIO, resolved the issue, and moved forward. What's the lesson here? You got to start listening to your customers. And I think for us being analysts, we have got to be listening to those customers too, because we can be a direct conduit to address some of these problems. In both of these cases, guess what happened? Both of those prospects and new customer, both of them went forward in building the relationship with this major vendor. We're talking tens to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue over the next couple of years from the point of that particular conversation that would have gone away. And that was resolved. Now, that's not a, hey, look at me. That's not my point of bringing up these examples. But this is the kind of value that we can bring. And then as a follow-up, have the conversation with the vendor around how can we make sure that we don't do this again? Like, because if I'm seeing it, others are seeing it too, right? And so I think this is where that relationship between the vendor and the customer, we've got to do a better job as an analyst persona, if you will, to be able to understand those dynamics and also help kind of grease some of those skids.
Indeed. We've got a lot of great comments going in the chat here. I've popped a bunch of them up on the screen. It has to do with things like where analysts are getting paid from, and having, I think, the courage to, I think, challenge vendors is a big theme. I did note in my piece that there's a lot of disclosure problems in our industry when it comes to analysts and where they're being funded. So there's many obstacles, obviously, in the path of all of this. But
Yeah.
I think there's a real hunger, I think, amongst customers that I talk to for a better integration of these kinds of conversations. And I don't like it when we're stuck in NDA rooms and then we hop on planes and there's a total disconnect between our NDA discussions and everything that's happening on the ground. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, John, can I go to a comment that Brian made?
Yeah.
So Brian made a comment about upsetting vendors, and I think this is part of the problem, right? Is that analysts and analyst firms, they kind of over rotate and it becomes very pay to play, or to Brian's point, you become dependent on that revenue stream, and so you tend to give them favor and be a little easier on them. And I don't think that does you a service or them a service.
Yeah.
And so what I've found is I have very specific business principles that I stand by. And I'm going to tell a vendor exactly what they need to hear. They may not like it, they may not want to hear it, but I'm going to tell them. And what this has meant is there are some vendors that do not like to work with me because I'm not going to sit there and just put their messaging on blast and pump it out to my CIO network. I'm not going to do it because I don't believe that. And so you have to decide what your principles are. Now, granted, I will prioritize clients over non-rev clients in terms of my time and where I'm going, and how I'm investing my time. But that's different than pay to play, and that's very different than your point of upsetting a vendor. So I think that the piece is we have to kind of change the culture where vendors have to be open to listening. And there's one vendor in particular that's coming to mind, and quite frankly, it's a vendor that has a very acerbic relationship with customers, and you probably know who that is. But they're also not very open to listening to customers and listening to analysts. And a lot of the analysts that work with them, they placate them, right? They essentially tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. So I think it's important to kind of stand by your business principles and get away from that pay to play as much as you can.
Indeed. And I I don't accept the principle that because you're getting paid by a vendor that you should roll over for them. And
Agreed.
And it's actually self-defeating because the vendor has to be successful in the long run. And so you're taking short-term paychecks, but you're losing ground in the long run because that vendor becomes more and more vulnerable the longer you become a mouthpiece for them and not challenge them. And God knows I've lost a lot of commercial relationships over the years for these reasons. And
Yeah.
it is what it is. Like, life is too short. The
That's
hell
right.
with it. I'm gonna speak the truth, and that's how it goes.
Yeah, but here's the thing, John. You sleep at night because you know what? You did the right thing. And if you're doing it for the benefit of the customer first, and going back to the I think it was a comment that was made, or maybe it was a comment you had made, is if you are working for the customer first and foremost, which is what I do, I'm coming in with that CIO mentality, like that customer first mentality. If you're coming in with that perspective first and foremost, the vendor is going to appreciate that. They're going to gain value from that, and you're going to orient yourself in the right way. And if you run across a vendor that doesn't appreciate that, well, guess what? That's not a great relationship to have in the first place. So maybe that's not one that you should be taking their money.
No,
So
it is not.
I would focus on those folks that are really interested in the customer perspective. And I'll be honest, in the relatively short period of time that I've been doing this, again, I'm not a career analyst, but in the short time that I've been doing this, one of the things that I have discovered is over time, more vendors are interested in that perspective, and they're becoming more open to hearing what they need to hear, not what they want to hear.
Let's hope so, because I still have memories of past hangovers from slide deck overdose. Uh, I still have a record, I think 150 slides covered in 1 hour. Because this whole thing has implications for whether it's a one-way relationship or a two-way dialogue and all of that,
Yeah.
which I get into on my piece in Next Gen Analyst Relations. We're gonna and you can search that on Diginomica. And like I said, Tim is planning to respond to that piece at some point.
Yes.
I wanted to hit on. There's a bunch of great comments. Thanks all of you, Tracy. I think that functional domain expertise is what's missing with a lot of analysts and consultants, for that matter.
Yep.
I think that's a really, really important point. That when you see that value, it's often coming from that deeper place, right? That's really authentic, right? Which is why it's like certain people in this chat, when they raise their hand, I know they've been doing this for a long time, and that's going to come out in the question they're about to ask. And like for you, if you're going to ask a question, it's like, okay, Tim's asking a question. I better stop checking my email during the slide deck and listen to what Tim has to say, because it's going to be good, because he's going to talk about what CIOs care about or what customers care about. So I think that domain thing is important.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, another way to gauge that is how much time are you spending with customers versus the vendors? And, Thomas, not Thomas, I'm sorry. It was Brian commented on this, right? Analysts that only cover vendors that have a material economic relationship with a given analyst firm, or even a given vendor. Like they only work with a couple of vendors. I mean, they're going to be biased, right? And so I think that's the other piece. I'm not saying that they have to be biased, but it makes it harder for them not to be biased. And so I do think that it's important to understand kind of, again, what are your principles? Who is it that you're ultimately trying to help? And I strongly believe if you help the customer, that will in turn help the vendor.
Yeah, so this is interesting, Jason. Do you feel some large vendors and partners are using Vietnam-style communications to manage media narratives and customer perception? Jason, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit as to attempt to manage, or perhaps in the futile attempt to manage. Because, Tim, I think that one interesting point here is that some vendors still think they can control the narrative and the conversation about themselves, and it's futile, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but just like trying to control certain individuals, whether it's analysts or customers, or try to put a wrap on things, it doesn't work. This stuff always comes out. If you don't think so, just do a search on your favorite vendor and put the word Reddit in the search. Or you could do the same thing on Glassdoor or whatever.
Yeah.
Just quit managing the narrative. It's not going to work. But anyways, Jason still has a question about that. Do you think some vendors fall into that trap?
Yeah, of course they do, and they're trying to overly control it. They're trying to use analysts as influencers, essentially, right? And they want to control the message. They want to control what gets out and what doesn't get out. And the problem with that is that yes, there are analysts that do that as well as influencers that do that. I don't think that's good. I don't think it's healthy. In the long run, when you look at what this is intended to ultimately accomplish, which is getting customers engaged. It's not just the eyeballs on a tweet or a post or whatnot. That's only part of the equation, but that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is getting the customer to say, you know what, I want to know more about that product, or can you help me address this issue, or I want to buy it. And that's the ultimate test. I think the more you control the narrative, the more you control the conversation. It's like, what's the old adage, right? It's like sand in your hand, right? It just falls between your fingers, right? The tighter you grip it, the more it falls through. And so the other piece to that question is the more experience you have with customers. So take me, for example. I have a significant amount of experience and ongoing engagement with customers. That's valuable. Those customers want to hear my voice, not the vendor's voice. They want to hear how I am looking at that particular vendor and what's happening with it. They're not looking for the marketing speak. They're not. They can get that any different way, right?
Indeed. And so another thing I said in my post, and we don't have time to get into this discussion today, but I do want to hit on it, which is I made the argument that a good chunk of analyst relations as it exists today, I consider quote unquote legacy, which is obviously a little bit insulting. So sorry about that. But it has to do with all the account servicing that is required for the Gartners, IDCs, and Forresters of this world in order to potentially remain on their various kinds of rankings and ratings and quadrants, trapezoids, whatever you want to call them, and that I view that model as somewhat archaic and problematic and non-transparent. And I get troubled when I hear people say, I don't know if I should have them as a client or not because I don't want this to affect how I appear and stuff like that. It's very confusing for them. So, but I'm not stupid enough to say that that's gone, or that I argue that the influence of that is diminished somewhat from the old days because of the open conversations that happen. But what I'm arguing is that this next gen concept needs to happen in parallel to that, and that it's important, and that the kind of conversations we're having today are important. And the reason for that, in my mind, ties in a little bit to Sam's comment here about how baked into reseller contracts, your contract could be canceled if you talk negatively about OEM solutions. And what I find, Tim, is that in a lot of vendor communities, there are certain constituent groups that do feel a bit muzzled, and they can't speak as openly on LinkedIn as they might want. Customers even feel that way because they don't want to get in trouble with their own PR and stuff like that. And so that's why I think it's so important to have vocal folks, not just analysts, but anyone who is in the community who can be outspoken. And I've seen that from people that work at big analyst firms also. So I'm not saying that there's some amazing people that work for those firms that are quite vocal in some of our conversations that we have. But the point is we need that because some people in these ecosystems just don't have the platform to share what's really going on.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think the other dynamic there, and I'm not going to call out the individual analyst firms, because I mean there are people there that they struggle. If I'm being kind, they struggle. And there are people there that I just have mad respect for, individuals. And so I think to your point, though, about each of these comparative grids and whatnot, one of the problems is it's not customer focused. And the methodologies that get used and the way that they approach it is, frankly, it's going too far afield. Like some of the comparisons just make absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. I mean, from a customer standpoint. So, for example, why would you compare Google Cloud with Salesforce? Why? A customer's not doing a bake-off of Salesforce against Google Cloud, right? They're looking at Azure, they're looking at AWS, they're looking at Google Cloud, right? There are certain swim lanes that go together. But as we're going through time, these grids and comparative reports and whatnot, it's so weird in how they're going about it. And I think, number one, it creates a disservice for the customer because it's misleading. It's completely misleading. But it also creates a credibility problem for these different firms too, that I'm not sure they really understand that. I don't know why they're doing this, but it creates a credibility problem where people just start to go, you know what, these are pointless. Like, why would I compare Salesforce and Google Cloud? I'm not going to do that. So what else are they misleading me on? So I think it's important that we understand the space, we understand what's going on here, and let's have an honest conversation about it. But that also isn't how people make decisions anymore either.
Indeed. And yeah, it's not the stone tablets anymore for sure. And Brian says vendors want control more than just the product narrative, news about activist shareholder issues, market uptake or decline, sales losses, SaaS customer counts, market update of new product lines. Indeed. In fact, a lot of times after news announcements, it feels like we're scurrying around afterwards trying to figure out how many customers are actually using these products, when they're going to come out, and all of that stuff. And, you know, to any of you in the chat, I would just say, regardless of whether you're an analyst or not, the more outspoken you can get away with being in your role, the better off your community and your products are going to be. But I do respect the fact that some people do feel that they have to be a little quiet, in which case try to feed the information to user groups and other people who can speak up, and because I think we get an inaccurate perception because of all the people that do feel like they can't say anything.
I think that that's absolutely true. But to Brian's point, if you break apart each of those pieces, which I'm not going to do, but if you look at what people are reporting on, do customers really care about this to the degree that the analysts think they do? Like if you're talking about activist shareholder issues, I might care about it, but I'm going to put it in a box, right? Now, the vendor cares about it, their competition cares about it, but does the customer care about it? And so I think, when you start talking about, like market uptake or decline, yeah, to some degree, recent sales losses, true SaaS customer counts, as a customer or prospect, I kind of don't care, right? I care in generalities, but do I care that, okay, it's up 2% this quarter year over year versus last quarter it was up 4% year over year? No, I don't care. Now, if you're an investor, maybe you care about that, but then you should be a financial analyst, not an industry analyst. And I think this is the other piece that people just kind of lose track of is, who is it that you're working for? Like, what the heck are you doing and who are you working for? And I will tell you this. So this is going to be a hard one to hear, because I also advise financial analysts. And I got to say, most of the financial analysts that I work with could run circles around the amount of knowledge and expertise and depth that they have over industry analysts in the same space, following the same companies. It's really that dramatic.
Interesting. I've had some conversations with some financial analysts recently that gave me a slightly different impression, but I will say the knowledge of markets and stuff is like unimpeachable for sure. I think sometimes they don't understand some of the nuances of things like how cloud numbers get reported and what that adoption looks like versus like private cloud, and how vendors play games with how those numbers are lumped in and stuff. But that's why I love the dialogue with the financial analysts, because they bring something so different to the table, whether or not you and I would agree fully on who knows more or what. But there's a really interesting thing, which is no coincidence that these groups are kept separate. It shows, because things would really get dangerous if these two groups were brought together. But I can understand why those two groups are not brought together, though, because there's legal implications for the financial analysts mingling with people like us that have arguably insider information that they don't have. So that's not going to change.
They'd never be allowed in a lot of ways, because if you've ever dealt with financial analysts, number one, you have to go through a series of compliance questions as part of every interaction. And most industry analysts would not be able to get through the questions successfully. I mean, the compliance teams would just say, no, can't talk to that person.
Well, I'm glad the stream stabilized. That makes me happy, because, like I said, it's been a little spotty on LinkedIn lately. We should wind down, because I'm starting to lose it, and we've run over. Those of you who know my show know that I don't do the super annoying, like, oh, it's the top of the hour, we have to stop because something happens at the top of the hour and we must implode at that point. I like to go until we're out of time, and I'm surprised by how much staying power, frankly, Tim, this topic had amongst the chat. You guys have been absolutely brilliant, and I tried to get to most of your comments, but there were a whole slew of them, and clearly we're going to need to return to this topic on my show in the future, because people actually do want to talk about it. So
yeah.
So did you have anything else? Because I know you had some different points on that next-gen topic.
We've covered a lot of ground. I think probably the best thing to do is, after I finish my rebuttal to your post. I don't think it's a rebuttal. I think frankly it's just building on what you've posted, and it's been a long time coming, quite frankly. But I do think we as an industry, if you will, need to have these conversations. AR professionals need to have it. Industry analysts need to have it, right? So we need to figure out how to do a better job, because ultimately we are all serving the customer. Done. Full stop.
Ooh, Jason says, bring you back, man. Sounds like some applause right there. Woo-hoo! Yeah, thanks, Jason. Actually, the thing about it for my show is my show's like a little unhinged, but it's very particular. So the hardest thing is getting someone on the first time. Once they make it on the first time, it's a lot easier to bring them back. So I think we can do that, and I would definitely be glad private cloud is indeed an oxymoron, and that I've had a lot of interesting talks with financial analysts about that very thing. And yes, everyone's comments are a part of this show. That's one of the factors that that I really believe in, is that the audience here knows way more than we do in a lot of these cases. So it's this group discussion, and I hope people enjoy that vibe. And I will try to keep that going, though I have a lot of travel coming up, so bear with me a little bit on these shows. But thanks a lot, Tim, for two excellent discussions. And yeah, I think this whole thing around this dialogue with vendors, I think, is really, really important. And for vendors who might feel that it's been a little overly critical, I just want to point out that a lot of my pieces argue for what to do about this problem and how to create formats that encourage the kind of dialogue and the customer-centric approach that we're describing. So I have put forth a lot of creative ideas. Only a few vendors have really taken me up on it, but I can tell you the ones that do are getting results. So I do want to say that those that take chances on more, like, I guess, engaging formats and more customer interactions and all that stuff, like, are getting some good results. But
and there's another piece to that, John. I mean, let's be honest about this. There's also the conversations you can have publicly with them and privately. And so one thing that I have observed is the private conversations, they tend to be far more candid, and they agree with many of the things that you and I have talked about and touched on. Publicly, they have to kind of hedge that a little bit, because maybe their senior person, or maybe they're just not on the same page yet.
100%. And that's a process, which is why I kind of describe that you can build towards this and notch wins over time. I'm not arguing for radical change overnight. I'm just saying that the water's warmer than you think, and people like Tim, myself, and a lot of people in the chat you see today are eager to help with that and get those views across. So definitely look at those comments in the chat. And Sam says you're the most honest and pragmatic CIO that Sam has recently met.
I'm getting that one plastered.
So there you go.
Thank you, Sam.
Had a blast today. Thanks for the fabulous chat, folks, and we'll catch you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.